My friend and I were up for the same promotion. He got it, but I didn't have any hard feelings until I learned about his betrayal. A week later, I'm suspended for stealing, cheating the clock, and a bunch of other stuff that I definitely didn't do. But here's the thing. I knew who was doing it, my friend. The one who is now my boss. That was the last straw. He was no longer my friend, and I knew the perfect way to make him pay for what he did to me. Not only did I take it over his head, I threatened legal action if they actually fired me. All of a sudden, they were scrambling to find any security footage they might need if I sued them. But I knew what they'd really find when they watched it. When they looked at all the evidence, they found he'd been stealing and manipulating the discount system. He'd tried to cover it up by implicating me. When confronted about his actions, he broke down, apologized, and returned some of the stolen items that he had planned to take after his shifts. It was truly shocking to realize that this person I'd considered a friend had tried to frame me in order to get ahead.
When we were growing up, my older brother was so spoiled, and yet he still took stuff from me all the time. Around the time of his 16th birthday, he got his driver's license. Our parents were kind enough to buy him a car. That very day, he left his bike unlocked on the curb, claiming that he'd never need it again. Within an hour, it was gone. I thought that was a dumb move. I was 13 at the time, and my bike was essential for transportation. Unfortunately, my brother, who had a tendency to misbehave and frequently got grounded, would also have his car keys taken away as punishment. Whenever this happened, he'd help himself to my bike without asking or telling me. Despite several warnings, he kept doing it. Consequently, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I deliberately loosened the handlebars on my bike. Witnessing the handlebars detach while he was riding and seeing him fall onto the pavement was incredibly satisfying, and served as a moment of triumph in my quest for revenge.
In gym class, there was this one guy who used to constantly bully me, as is often the case with jocks targeting nerds. But on one particular day, while leaving the gym, he took it too far. He snatched my hat. It was a simple baseball cap with nothing special about it, but I had finally reached my breaking point. Driven by anger, I started pursuing him around the gym. However, I quickly realized the futility of my plan, being a nerd against a jock. He was heading towards the exit doors, and I knew that if he escaped, I would lose my hat forever. All I had on me was my book bag, hanging on my back. That's when it came to me. At that moment, I stopped, watched him closely, and slid my book bag across the freshly waxed basketball court. Just as he was about to push open the door, the bag slid perfectly under his foot, causing him to trip and crash into the door with great force. He collapsed onto the floor in a bloody mess, crying like a baby. Walking past him, I calmly placed my bag back on my shoulder, retrieved my hat from his grasp, and effortlessly stepped over his convulsing body. There was a teacher in the room, but he must have thought the bully had it coming, because I never faced any consequences for what I did. From that day forward, the bully never uttered another word to me.
I once went skiing at a local mountain as part of a school trip. Although my skis weren't the best, they still did the job. As the day came to an end, I placed my skis in the last slot on the crowded rack and turned to go inside and get a hot chocolate. Suddenly, I was caught off guard. I heard a crash and quickly turned around. To my surprise, this woman had knocked my skis out of the rack and was putting their own expensive skis in their place. I confronted her, saying, "Hey, you just knocked over my skis. What's going on?" She said, "These skis are new, and I want to protect them in the rack. Your skis are pretty worn out, so I figured you wouldn't mind putting them on the ground." I was so taken aback that I had no idea what to do. I picked up my skis and moved them elsewhere, but I was still furious at her. Watching the lady head towards the lodge, it suddenly dawned on me what I would do next. She just told me that it was time for me to upgrade my skis, so I made a decision. I gathered my belongings, leaving behind my own skis, and swiftly took her nice skis off the rack. Then, I hopped on the bus back to school. No doubt about it, those skis really are impressive.
I had a prank war going on with my coworker for years, and my final prank ended up being revenge for the very first one. It all started when my coworker Tom, who frequently visited my office for help, noticed a picture of my mother on my desk. I had it there because I missed her, but he couldn't resist saying how hot she was, day after day. Frustrated by his endless remarks, I hatched a plan. I convinced my mom to call Tom at work and scold him for being a negative influence. She found the whole idea amusing. Unfortunately, my scheme backfired spectacularly. Once he realized it was just a prank, he ended up talking to my mom for an entire hour. To top it off, he told everyone in the office that my mom was hitting on him. From that day forward, Tom took great pleasure in asking me about my mom and when she would call again. He even went so far as to record her number and called her on New Year's Eve just to taunt me. Fast forward to my 5-year work anniversary celebration, where Tom decided to regale a room full of higher-ranking individuals with the embarrassing story. Naturally, I turned beet red. That's when I made up my mind to get back at him. I'd recently gone through a breakup, and because he was a good 2 decades older than me, he constantly offered unsolicited advice on how I should be dating and exploring my options. Taking matters into my own hands, I discovered Tom's daughter's name and found her on Facebook. I approached her with a proposition to prank her father, and she agreed. We went out for dinner, and I captured a photo of us sharing a drink with 2 straws. I had it printed and placed it in a heart-shaped frame on my desk. With a little help from my boss, word got back to Tom that I had a new romantic interest, with her picture proudly displayed on my desk. Within moments of hearing the news, he entered my office. He stood in stunned silence for a while before uttering, "But that's my daughter." Since that prank, Tom has finally stopped asking about my mom. Oh, and as a delightful Christmas surprise, I had a mug made featuring that picture, accompanied by the words "World's Greatest Dad."
My ex and I were planning to get married, and my parents had already paid for a grand wedding. The whole idea was his, and it was quite extravagant. Then one day, I received a call that changed everything. It was from a girl who claimed to be carrying his child. At that time, he was serving in the army and was stationed in Alaska while I remained at home. When I confronted him about it, he denied everything, insisting that it was a fabrication and merely a ploy by her to gain American citizenship through a soldier's child. I was young and in love, so I chose to believe him. However, the girl persisted in calling me repeatedly. I still don't know how she got my number, but it doesn't matter. About 3 months before the wedding, his best friend contacted me, confirming that the allegations were indeed true and that he had been unfaithful throughout his time away. That's when I decided to finally answer the poor girl's calls. She even offered to undergo a paternity test. She claimed she only found out about my existence shortly before she began reaching out. Frustrated and bewildered, I gave my ex-partner an opportunity to explain and be honest with me. I hoped he would confess and that we could somehow work through the situation. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. He looked me in the eye and lied, and even insulted her. So, I insisted that he consent to a paternity test. He flat out refused. I'd wanted to help the girl and now I felt hopeless. But then, I remembered something. His commanding officer was good friends with both my father and his father. I let my father know about this, knowing exactly what he would do. He promptly contacted his 2 friends, who convinced my ex's father to take the test in his place. As it turned out, my ex was indeed the father of the baby girl. Now, he's obligated to pay child support to the mother who restricts his visitation rights, and he has lost a significant amount of respect from his superiors. Additionally, he had to reimburse my father for the cancelled wedding expenses, move to a cheaper apartment, and sell a large portion of his musical equipment. During this process, he had to part with his cherished car, which he held dear even more than anyone or anything else. On my end, I took the engagement ring and sold it, earning $10,000. I used the money to go on a honeymoon with my friends.
I can now safely confess to something that happened around 8 years ago. It started when I was hired by a law firm to handle their IT needs and provide training services. Initially, it was a balanced split between IT and training responsibilities. However, over time, the focus shifted more towards training, and the IT tasks were handed off to a few others. Eventually, someone expressed interest in taking over the training role, so they requested that I train someone new. Little did I know that this would mark the beginning of a nightmare. It turned out that this person simply wanted an easier job and quickly realized that training was not as simple as they had anticipated. They wanted to return to their previous duties, but I had already invested significant effort in planning various training sessions with them. I couldn't simply let them go without finding a replacement. To complicate matters, the firm was going through some financial difficulties and had already initiated layoffs. Unfortunately, this meant that the company decided to eliminate training altogether. They brought me in for a talk and laid me off, but there was something I didn't expect. They used a made-up charge as justification for letting me go, claiming that I had logged into the system from home and clocked out. I did log in from home, but I had proper authorization from the IT director as I worked on training materials remotely. The IT director lied to my face, saying they never let me work from home. Nevertheless, I managed to find a job elsewhere and moved on, forgetting the firm for a while. One day, while working for the new company, we were in the process of purchasing a large plot of land to construct a new downtown office. This multi-million-dollar project would serve as our headquarters for more than 10,000 members. But when I went through the paperwork, I recognized a name from the past. The law firm that had unjustly fired me was set to handle the sale, and they were going to earn a significant fee from the transaction. This presented a perfect opportunity for me to seek revenge. I told my company's president everything I knew about the firm, how they skimped on staffing and training, leading to a lot of mistakes, and how their cybersecurity was severely lacking. But then I took it to the next level. Using what I'd learned when I worked there, I hacked into their server and demonstrated to our president how easily personal information could be accessed. That very morning, our president severed ties with them. Even better, he reached out to other places and convinced them to avoid using the firm as well. Although I don't take pride in the unintended consequences that affected a few people in the IT department, as word spread about the firm's security vulnerabilities, I can't help but feel satisfied. The director who lied about giving me permission to work from home was among those who were let go after they lost all the contracts.
A few years ago, I used to have a side gig writing essays for other people. One particular girl hired me a bunch of times to write all her application essays for 8 different schools. Even though we'd agreed to a set price for all the work beforehand, she only paid me a fraction of what was agreed upon. What was even more frustrating was that I knew she was incredibly wealthy and spent like $10,000 shopping for designer clothes and bags. She had more than enough money to pay me, but she chose to screw me over instead, even though my essays played a crucial role in securing her admission to a much better school than she initially hoped for. I guess she thought I would just sit back and take it. In a way, I did, because I knew that karma would do the job of getting revenge for me. The school I helped her get into was way too demanding academically for her. She ended up struggling and flunked most of her classes, which eventually led to her expulsion. Sure, she saved a few dollars by not paying me, but she lost a whole lot more on tuition.
When my wife was heavily pregnant at home and needed my help, my manager abruptly switched me to the night shift. To add insult to injury, he gave me a negative performance review, even though I had a substantial pile of printed emails from satisfied customers who praised my work. We got through it and I found a better job eventually, but I never forgot what a jerk move that was. Nearly a decade later, my wife, who works in HR, recognized a familiar voice in the office next door during a job interview. She was curious and checked his name. It turned out to be none other than my former manager. Taking matters into her own hands, my wife decided to have a conversation about him with the interviewer. After the dust settled, he didn't get the job. When my wife told me, I couldn't believe it. I was so happy, especially knowing that he'd never suspected was me and my wife who single-handedly sabotaged his chance at the job.
When I was in my early 20s, I was living in New York City. My then boyfriend chose to ditch our planned date night and join his colleagues for a night of drinking. Ordinarily, this wouldn't have been an issue, except I had left some important work documents that I needed for the following day on his desk. So, I decided to let myself into his place. Little did I know that what followed would seal his unfortunate fate. I found myself in his office when he stumbled home with an unfamiliar woman, both of them completely wasted. I could hear them hooking up in the next room. I was shocked, too shocked to confront them, so I slipped out of the office and left without them noticing. Deep down, I knew it was time to end the relationship, but I was too embarrassed to admit that I had discovered his cheating. Instead, early the next morning, I showed up at his doorstep without warning. With frustratingly vague explanations, I put an end to our relationship, citing that things just weren't working for me anymore. I never expected his reaction. He spiraled into a state of frenzy. Over the next 2 months, he begged and cried, suspecting that I had somehow discovered his cheating. He went as far as accusing his coworkers and friends who were out with him that night of betraying him. Really, he was only digging his own grave. Unfortunately for him, this only made them realize what a terrible person he truly was. His accusations and volatile behavior began to escalate, making those around him uncomfortable and posing a liability in the workplace. As a result, he was fired. Next, all his friends and his roommates got in touch with me, confiding how much respect they'd lost for him and how they didn't want to be around him anymore. His old roommates even found a new place without him. To add to his woes, his former roommates signed a new lease without him. With no job and no support from roommates, he was left with no choice but to return to his hometown and move in with his parents. I got revenge without even lifting a finger.
Throughout the entire semester, I had the terrible experience of having this one super annoying classmate. He would consistently sit in the corner and claim to be working, but I often caught him watching Glee instead. However, as soon as the professor entered the room, he would quickly spring into action. He would speak highly of our progress, but when midterm time arrived, he had nothing to show. He then went on a search for help, approaching everyone from the poor teaching assistant to other team members. As it turns out, it was pretty hard to conjure up a midterm project overnight when he had spent the entire semester watching Glee. Because we were going to present our team project in architecture to the whole department, it would have looked really bad to have a massive glaring void where his part of the project was supposed to be. As a result, the rest of the team and the sympathetic Toss stepped in and pulled an all-nighter to complete his project. It was during this episode that everyone in the program realized just how incompetent he really was. He had absolutely no understanding of how buildings function or how to design them. I distinctly recall an argument he had with the team regarding where walls and floors intersect. The things he was saying were absolutely ridiculous. We were all working on traditional Italian masonry house designs. and he insisted that each floor should extend 2 to 3 feet beyond the perimeter of the walls, resulting in floors protruding from the walls. He truly believed this was the correct way to construct his model. You can imagine the disbelief amongst us, especially considering he was a third-year architecture student. Despite his ignorance and lackluster effort, he still had the audacity to flaunt his work in front of the professor and make derogatory remarks about his only friend, claiming he was so much better than him. Things only got worse from that moment on. By the end of the semester, he and his one and only friend were no longer on speaking terms. The professor was not oblivious and quickly caught on to his gains. While the rest of us received perfect marks, he was awarded a C, a grade that, in my opinion, was still too generous. However, everything changed when finals approached. Unfortunately, we, the team, realized that if we wanted a successful project, we would have to pick up his slack. And if you know architecture students, you know that our reputation lies in our ability to work tirelessly on a project day and night. Obviously, the same couldn't be said about him, and he hadn't learned his lesson after getting that C. Each night as we worked on the final project, he'd watch Glee. Then, around 11 p.m., he would abandon his TV session, complain about a headache, and declare his need for sleep. Initially, we tried to reason with him, explaining that he couldn't afford to sleep with no progress made a week before the final. But soon enough, we noticed that our project flowed more smoothly and was more enjoyable to work on when he was not around, so we stopped intervening. During the 2 weeks leading up to finals, we dedicated our efforts to our individual projects. Then, when 11 p.m. struck, we dedicated an extra 2 to 3 hours to complete his work. Even though we were doing his work for him, he still wanted to argue and use his own nonsensical methods. This led to numerous confrontations in the studio, often resulting in him making a girl cry or irritating everyone else in the program. Somehow, we all survived the semester, but I didn't forget how annoying he was. The following year, I secured a job in the department, managing various social media groups, including the department's Facebook page. That's when I decided to get the most petty revenge. It didn't take long for me to discover the ability to remove individuals from the page. So, each time he annoyed me, I would delete him from the page. In the grand scheme of things, it wasn't a significant consequence. He simply missed out on announcements about guest lectures he probably wouldn't have attended anyway. However, it brought me weekly satisfaction, and seeing him like the page again was an added bonus. This happened 2 or 3 times until, upon leaving the position, I permanently banned him. Despite his attempts to force his misguided theories upon me and the hours I spent completing his project, my revenge was admittedly petty. Still, the feeling of power and excitement that coursed through me when I first removed him from the page was indescribable. He eventually switched majors and is now diligently working towards obtaining a structural engineering license to design buildings in your vicinity. Don't walk under any new construction, folks.
Back when I was in high school, I was super self-conscious about my breath, so I always carried gum with me in my backpack. Other kids would always ask me for it. But even worse than that, someone began stealing it from me. After the 3rd or 4th time it happened, I knew I had to do something. I got a new pack, carefully unwrapped each piece, and took out the bitter-tasting nail polish my mom had got me to stop me from biting my nails. I painted a thin coat on each piece, wrapped them back up, and put them back in the pack. The next day, I could hear the guy who sat behind in my math retching. The gum was gone, but he never stole from me again.
Back in the early days of the internet, I held the position of manager for a tech support department at an internet service provider. Our company had 2 call centers and a data center. Communication between buildings was done through AOL Instant Messenger. Everyone just used their personal accounts. This was before the days of Slack and Teams. A new CEO arrived and decided that all chat clients should be eliminated because they could be used for non-work purposes. It was amusing to hear this solution, especially considering the CEO had no IT background whatsoever. His brilliant idea: just use the phone. However, this posed a problem. We were doing tech support. We were already on the phone with clients, so how could we call teammates? I suggested creating work-only handles for messaging, but the CEO dismissed the idea, promising that our developers would eventually build an internal chat client. But, as expected, this never came to fruition. As luck would have it, I also had admin access to the mail server. Curiosity got the best of me, and I started reading the emails of this foolish CEO. To my surprise, I discovered that he was spending the majority of his time exchanging emails with his girlfriend in Colorado. Not only that, but they were also exchanging more intimate pictures, some of which were taken in his own office. I printed out this extensive collection, even though it required a whole ream of paper, and presented it to the company's owner. Unsurprisingly, the CEO was fired the following day. The moral of this tale is simple: if you dare to cross paths with the admins, make sure you have a squeaky clean record.
There was a woman at my old job who was probably the most infuriating person I'd ever met. She not only treated me poorly, but she treated everyone that way. She constantly inserted her opinions into conversations that didn't involve her and would frequently try to undermine others. She had a habit of prying into personal matters, attempting to extract information and then spreading gossip about it. What made it worse was that she did all of this with a straight face, knowing that she was disliked by her colleagues, but not caring one bit. People would pretend to be friends with her just to avoid being tormented or betrayed. However, what really bothered me was her terrible driving. We happened to take the same route home every day, and she would tailgate me and cut me off. It was as if she had no regard for anyone's safety, coming dangerously close to causing an accident. She would even bring up her reckless driving the next day at work, making comments like "you need to speed up and stop causing a traffic jam." Fed up with her antics, I decided to take matters into my own hands. One day, I looked up her driving records, which were publicly available where I live. There were about 1 million speeding tickets and other infractions. But, to my surprise, I discovered that she had been previously detained for driving under the influence. Initially, I thought about exposing this information to my coworkers, but it felt wrong. Instead, I printed out the court docket and discreetly placed it on her desk where she would find it. Upon discovering it, I witnessed her expression transform from shock to horror as she glanced nervously around the office. All of a sudden, she got a lot more quiet during the day and drove a lot slower on the way home.